glamour, greed, and a hidden empire. From the outside, Beverly Hills was the crown jewel of post-war Hollywood. Elegant mansions, palm-lined streets, and a parade of movie stars living the American dream. It was where deals were inked poolside, studio heads threw lavish parties, and gossip columnists camped outside in hopes of catching a scandal. But behind those manicured hedges and iron gates, a very different kind of empire was operating in silence. What the world saw as luxury, the mob saw as opportunity. As Hollywood grew into a billion-dollar industry, the underworld quietly laid down roots in the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. Not with Tommy guns or drive-bys, but with real estate, restaurant fronts, off-the-books investments, and backroom deals. And the most surprising part? Some of the biggest names in entertainment were either playing along or completely unaware they were being used. Beverly Hills became the perfect camouflage. While the police and the press were busy chasing celebrities, mobsters were laundering money through construction companies, high-end talent agencies, and even the homes of unsuspecting stars. Some properties were bought in cash, no questions asked. Others were gifted in deals that looked legit, but weren't. To the public, these were just the perks of fame. But to the mob, they were leverage. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. Control over who got financed, who got protection, and who got silenced. And if someone tried to speak up, well, let's just say there were always enough shadows in Beverly Hills to make someone disappear, figuratively or otherwise. And this was just the beginning. Because once the mob figured out how to use Beverly Hills as a front, they didn't just stop at homes and hush money. They built an entire empire out of it. If Hollywood was the heart of American entertainment, then Beverly Hills was its private clubhouse, and the mob wanted in. Not through shootouts or shady clubs this time, but through something far more subtle: property ownership. In the 1940s and 50s, real estate in Beverly Hills was exploding. New mansions, apartment buildings, and hotels sprang up as stars and studio execs flocked to the area. But behind many of these construction booms were silent partners, figures tied to the East Coast and Chicago mobs who saw land not as luxury, but as the perfect laundromat for their dirty cash. Through front companies, cash buyers, and shell corporations, the mob bought up blocks of property. A house would be sold 3 times in 2 years, with each deal inflating its price. That paper trail made millions in illegal gambling, extortion, and narcotics appear squeaky clean. And because Beverly Hills was synonymous with wealth, no one thought twice about lavish sales or inflated values. Some homes were even used as safe houses, unassuming mansions where mobsters on the run could hide out disguised as producers, agents, or family friends of Hollywood insiders. Others were party spots, where deals were made, favors were exchanged, and sometimes stars were compromised. Rumors swirled for years that some of the most luxurious estates weren't owned by stars at all, but by criminal investors who let actors live there in exchange for loyalty or silence. In some cases, even the actors didn't know who was really holding the deed. It wasn't just about having a house with a pool. It was about owning the land beneath Hollywood's feet and controlling who got to live, work, and thrive on it. And while the stars were busy enjoying the spotlight, the mob was setting the stage for something even bigger: a direct pipeline into the studios themselves. Once the mob had its hands on the homes, the next step was controlling the people who lived in them, the stars, producers, and directors who made the whole town tick. And there was no better way to do that than through the very institutions meant to protect them: talent agencies and fixers. During Hollywood's golden age, major agencies held immense power. They managed the careers of rising actors, controlled access to studio executives, and negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts. But behind some of those slick suits and power lunches were mob-connected figures who operated under the radar. Some agents weren't agents at all. They were fronts for organized crime, planted inside Hollywood to serve one purpose: keep the mob's investments protected and profitable. Want a role in a major picture? Better talk to the right guy. Need a scandal buried? There's a fixer who can make that go away for a price. And if you cross the wrong people, that same fixer might not be so friendly next time. Figures like Johnny Roselli, who had ties to both the Chicago outfit and major Hollywood circles, acted as liaisons between stars and syndicates. He rubbed elbows with producers, arranged funding for films, and was said to have influence over casting decisions. On the surface, it looked like networking. Behind the scenes, it was manipulation, plain and simple. Even studios turned a blind eye when mob-linked agents brought them talent and cash. A project with shaky funding could suddenly be greenlit if the right partner stepped in, and actors with questionable reputations found their names suddenly erased from tabloid headlines, after an untraceable payment, of course. In Beverly Hills, it wasn't just who you knew, it was who owned you. And in more cases than anyone dared to admit, the people pulling the strings weren't producers or publicists, but men with scars, rings, and long memories. And their reach didn't stop at agents. Next, they moved straight into the heart of the studios. By the early 1950s, Beverly Hills had become a staging ground for quiet power plays, and the studios were the ultimate prize. The mob didn't just want to control where stars lived or who represented them. They wanted to be in the room where the money was made. Studio executives, some naive, others complicit, welcomed outside investment during risky productions. At a time when making movies was a gamble, the mob offered quick, untraceable cash. Productions that couldn't get traditional funding suddenly moved forward after a few phone calls and a handshake in a smoky back office. But that money came with invisible strings. Mob-backed financiers didn't just want returns. They wanted influence over who got hired, what scripts got made, and sometimes who got blacklisted. There are even whispers that certain mob-connected producers inserted coded scenes or characters into films, subtle messages to enemies or allies, hidden in plain sight. In some cases, big-name stars were cast not because they were the best fit, but because they owed favors. Or worse, because compromising material existed that kept them on a short leash. Do this film, or your secrets become public. And just like that, the mob had its hooks into careers, reputations, and legacies. Production crews weren't immune either. Teamsters, who controlled everything from lighting to logistics, were heavily unionized. And many of those unions had already been infiltrated by mob-affiliated bosses who could stall or sabotage shoots unless their demands were met. Miss a payment? Suddenly your film had no trucks, or your lead actor got sick. And once the film was done, the mob wasn't done. Some distribution companies were owned by syndicate members, and they could bury a film or make it a hit, depending on how cooperative the people behind it were. It wasn't just about laundering money anymore. It was about rewriting the rules of Hollywood, from the top down, one studio at a time. But how did this all stay hidden for so long? That's where the fear came in. By the mid-20th century, Beverly Hills was glowing on the outside, but rotting underneath. The mob's grip reached from the hills to the studio lots, but what really held their empire together was fear. A fear so carefully curated that even whispers of disloyalty could end careers or lives. Scandals in Hollywood were nothing new. Affairs, addictions, bankruptcies, tabloids ate them up. But some stories never saw print. That's because the mob had leverage, not just over the stars, but over the press itself. Certain gossip columnists were paid off to kill stories before they ever reached the public. Others were warned, publish this, and you're done. It wasn't just about silencing the press. It was about controlling perception. Public image was everything. And if the mob could make or break reputations, they could manipulate anyone. Directors who resisted funding deals suddenly found themselves blackballed. Writers who pushed back saw their scripts shelved indefinitely. And actors who tried to expose the truth? Some left town. Others disappeared from the industry altogether. Even worse were the personal threats. Some stars were blackmailed with compromising photos taken at mob-run parties or private business dinners. Others were forced to sign contracts under pressure, threats to family, finances, or secrets they'd hoped would never surface. The deeper someone was pulled into the lifestyle, the harder it became to escape. And if they did try to walk away, the consequences were swift. One famous actress from the era reportedly tried to expose a mob-connected producer who'd exploited her contract. Days before her scheduled press conference, she suffered a breakdown and was sent to a private facility. The story vanished. Her career never recovered. Even the police were compromised. A few well-placed donations to Beverly Hills precincts meant certain arrests never happened. And when a murder did occur, if it was tied to the mob, it was labeled a robbery gone wrong or accidental overdose. The golden age of Hollywood was a facade. Behind the bright lights, it was fear, not fame, that kept the biggest names in line. But even empires built on fear eventually face exposure. And Beverly Hills wouldn't stay quiet forever. By the late 1960s, the image of a flawless Beverly Hills began to unravel, not because the mob loosened its grip, but because the truth started leaking out. Hollywood's younger generation wasn't as easy to control. The post-studio system era brought independent filmmakers, rebellious stars, and counterculture journalists who weren't afraid to ask questions. Suddenly, the whispers that had echoed through backrooms for decades were turning into investigations, leaks, and lawsuits. A few daring reporters began connecting the dots. Unexplained funding on mid-budget films, mysterious disappearances of starlets, and shady producers with zero film credentials, but plenty of underworld connections. FBI files started surfacing, documents that hinted at long-standing surveillance of mob figures known to frequent Hollywood homes, studio backlots, and even award ceremonies. One explosive case involved a Beverly Hills mansion that caught fire under suspicious circumstances. The home was tied to a known mob front, but also to a major film executive whose rise had never quite made sense. The official cause? Faulty wiring. But insiders swore the blaze was a cover-up, meant to destroy documents tied to laundering operations through film budgets and box office returns. Meanwhile, congressional hearings on organized crime included testimonies that, while vague, acknowledged entertainment business entanglements. Suddenly, phrases like silent investors and offshore film deals took on a new meaning. Even the IRS got involved, digging into suspicious tax returns from Beverly Hills production houses. Some stars, once terrified, began speaking in coded language during interviews. "You don't say no to certain people," one actor hinted during a magazine profile. "There were scripts you didn't decline. There were parties you had to attend." The veil of glamour was lifting, but even with mounting suspicion, there was still a wall of silence, reinforced by power, money, and buried secrets. And as the 1970s dawned, it was clear. The mob wasn't gone. They had just evolved. The more the spotlight shifted toward their crimes, the more the mob shifted its strategy. Gone were the cigar-chomping enforcers and overt threats. In their place, silent partners, consultants, and philanthropists. By the 1970s and into the 1980s, organized crime families realized that brute force wasn't sustainable, not in an industry built on image and illusion. So instead of backing away, they simply evolved. Beverly Hills remained a center of influence, but now the mob's presence looked respectable. Some syndicate figures cleaned up their records and rebranded as investors or legitimate businessmen. They poured money into production companies, music labels, and celebrity management firms. A few even appeared in Hollywood trade papers as backers of upcoming films, hiding in plain sight, their pasts scrubbed with the help of high-priced lawyers and political donations. They moved from threats to favors. Instead of blackmail, it was exclusivity. "We'll fund your project. No questions asked, but you'll work with our editor and our guy will direct." It sounded generous. It was calculated. Control disguised as opportunity. Real estate was also a major tool. Beverly Hills homes were flipped, leased, or gifted to talent under complex LLC structures that made tracing ownership nearly impossible. In reality, many of these properties remained under quiet mob control, creating ongoing leverage over the stars who lived there. And then came the offshore money. Shell companies in the Cayman Islands, Panama, and beyond became common tools for laundering film profits. Fake international box office numbers, inflated production costs. Creative accounting became a Hollywood tradition, and the mob knew how to exploit it better than anyone. Meanwhile, some of the biggest stars of the 80s and 90s had no idea their early careers had been funded, at least partially, by money with blood on it. Others knew, but said nothing. Careers depended on discretion, and that's what made Beverly Hills so dangerous. It wasn't the violence anymore. It was the silence, the complicity, the fact that the mob had become part of the system. But as the 2000s approached, one final chapter would unfold. The fallouts, the arrests, and the legacy they left behind. By the early 2000s, many of the original mobsters who had haunted Beverly Hills' mansions and studio lots were either long gone or unrecognizably rebranded. But their influence, still deeply embedded in the DNA of Hollywood. Some of the once mob-funded production companies had grown into legitimate giants. The shady investors of the past were replaced by corporate boards, but the accounting tricks, off-the-books deals, and strategic silence remained eerily familiar. You could argue the mob had taught Hollywood how to bend the system, and the system kept bending. Meanwhile, buried scandals from the Golden Age started resurfacing. Biographies, documentaries, and newly declassified FBI files began confirming what many insiders had whispered for decades, that the mob didn't just brush up against Hollywood, it practically wore the tux. Names like Bugsy Siegel, Mickey Cohen, and Johnny Rosselli appeared not only in FBI reports, but in studio memos, call sheets, and payroll logs. Some studios faced quiet audits and quiet settlements. Others distanced themselves from the past entirely, pretending those names had never crossed their books. But historians and curious fans were paying attention. Modern true crime documentaries began peeling back the layers. Films that once seemed like innocent art projects were revealed to be vessels for laundering dirty money. Celebrity tell-alls hinted at strange benefactors who appeared just before a breakout role. And Beverly Hills itself, once seen as pure glamour, was exposed as a carefully manicured illusion, built in part on fear, favors, and silence. Even today, some real estate records and production logs from the mid-century era remain sealed, protected by privacy laws or mysteriously lost. But enough dots have been connected to paint a damning picture. Hollywood's golden age was a stage, and behind the curtain stood men in fedoras holding the strings. From red carpets to backroom deals, from glamorous premieres to whispered threats in Beverly Hills mansions, Hollywood's golden age was more than just lights, camera, and action. It was a high-stakes performance where the mob didn't just play a role, they directed the show. While stars dazzled the world with charm and talent, many of them were operating under invisible contracts, bound not just by studios but by fear. The mob wasn't just a shadow lurking on the outskirts. They were inside the boardrooms, behind the cameras, holding the keys to careers, studios, and secrets. But perhaps the most chilling part of it all? How deeply the silence ran. The actors, producers, and executives who knew the truth rarely spoke. Whether out of fear or self-preservation, they helped maintain the illusion that Beverly Hills was just glitz and sunshine. And that illusion worked. So well, in fact, that for decades the average moviegoer never suspected a thing. But behind every iconic film and Walk of Fame star was a network of influence that stretched far beyond Tinseltown. The mob didn't need to carry guns into Hollywood. They carried contracts, cash, and consequences. Today, the mansions still stand, the studios still thrive, but the past lingers like cigar smoke in a velvet-curtained room, impossible to ignore once you know where to look. Because once upon a time, Hollywood wasn't just mobbed up, it was built that way.